Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'm Victoria Schofield, and I'm delighted to be back in Lahore. I've lost count of how many times I've been here, so it's a great thrill. And I'm delighted that you've all stayed or come to listen to Bigotry Brigade, Where is India Headed? In preference for Between Tradition and Modernity, another book launch, The Global Lines of Turkish Soap Operas, and a wonderful presentation, which I'm afraid I can't quite read because it's in Urdu. So thank you very much for being in Hall 1 rather than in Halls 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm also delighted to have my panelists, who are known to me in varying degrees. Audrey Truschke, Associate Professor at the University of Rutgers in New Jersey. Dr. Nitasha Kaul, who is a multidisciplinary academic and novelist, and she's worked on themes relating to identity, democracy, political economy, feminist and post-colonial critiques, and of course Kashmir. And we have shared many panels, most recently in London. I was in conversation with Nitasha launching her book, a novel, Future Tense. So if you haven't thought about going to the next session where she's going to be talking about her book, I recommend that you do, and then you buy the book. It's a wonderful novel. And my final speaker is Vali Nasr. We've only just met, and so I apologize that I don't know as much about you as I should do. Former dean and professor at Johns Hopkins, and he's written a lot on Pakistan in relation to religion, politics, and populism. So I think we've got a really good panel. And what I would like to say is the title of our talk this afternoon, Bigotry Brigade, shouldn't just be a bashing India session. It is quite a provocative title, but the subtitle is Where is India Heading? And I think it would be really important if we could look critically at where you as Pakistanis think this great country, India, your neighbor, is heading, because inevitably where India is heading will also affect Pakistan. And I think that's quite an important aspect. You can't choose your neighbors. You'll always be neighbors. It's just one of those geographical facts. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Vali and ask you, from your writing on Pakistan viewpoint, we've seen India at the moment probably at its most aggressive in many respects in terms of what's coming out of India. The BJP-1 government, we now talk about BJP-2, elected last year in May 2019. And that was one aspect of India. But then we've also got the aspect of India, which, as we know, famously moved into Kashmir, the state of Jammu and Kashmir, revoked Article 370, which had granted Jammu and Kashmir a degree of autonomy, already eroded. That was one aspect, but then the next thing is the CAA, the Citizens Amendment Act, and that has changed the character of the India that we have all been accustomed to. So within that context, just a broad brush, where is India heading?
Well, I guess if we sort of,
can you hear it back?
Can you hear me? If we pull the aperture a bit further back and looked at where does India's policies fit in terms of where other countries are going outside of South Asia, the trend line of trying to connect the identity of state to a particular religion or ethnic identity is also happening in Turkey. It's happened even in Pakistan itself in the 1970s under General Zia. It's happened in Iran. It's happened in many different countries. In fact, it's happening at some level in the United States, where very subtly President Trump is sort of casting America as essentially, in terms of a white identity, as having...
And also a religious identity.
Religious Christian white identity. So in that sense, you would say India is not actually unique. But the process is obviously in India has certain degree of internal violence or coercion associated with it. And again, to some degree, the model maybe that India has in front of it is actually China, which has a very coherent relationship between identity, ideology, and state. And its handling of minorities, as we're seeing with the Uyghurs, is very intolerant, is very bigoted, and in a sense, even the head of Indian military recently said that the concentration camps for the Uyghurs are actually a model for India to follow in Kashmir of de-radicalizing or changing the political, religious perspectives of the local population. So it's an ambitious agenda, not only to sort of replace Nehruvian India with something else, but with Modi's stamp on it, but also sort of give much more coherence to the state around the identity of Hindutva. I think the key issue is whether India would succeed in doing that, and then what sort of an India ends up at the end, or that India might fail in trying to do so, and then what are the consequences of that failure?
Yes. Well, Nitasha, you're from the state of Jammu and Kashmir. You live in Britain, so you have a sort of a double perspective. You can look at it from a distance, but at the same time, you're from within. And I think it's very important that we have a voice that is from within. How do you see in this, I mean, you can't look necessarily in the crystal ball, but would you agree that we're in a transitionary phase, which in our lifetimes is exceptional, or in the post-partition phase is a far more brutal phase of India? I mean, I totally take what Vali says in terms of it's happening in other countries as well, but it's quite a brutal phase of India. We all grew up with, oh, India, yoga, lovely, go on holiday, but now people are looking very differently at going to India.
So, yeah, absolutely. I feel like, some of us, we feel like we're Cassandras. We keep saying this is why this is problematic and wrong and dangerous, and the warnings are not heeded because people think you're just being anti-national. And it's to follow on from what Vali you used the phrase aperture, just to zoom back. So camera is my favorite metaphor too, and I think it's really important both to zoom in and to zoom out to look at what the developments are. And I feel like to understand what's going on right now, we have to at least go back to the early 90s to see how the simultaneous arrival of neoliberal policies in the form of what was called liberalization at the time and the Hindutva, the first kind of successes of Hindutva in the early 90s with the Rath Yatras and the Babri Masjid and so on, that it was both a political and an economic moment of great change that has actually, even in scholarly literature, not been adequately understood, like why are these two things happening together. And some of those paradoxes we now see in India and elsewhere in leaders who are at least claim to be both nationalist and neoliberal at the same time, and who continue to mobilize people into toxic projects of hate by manipulating imaginaries of time, of pride and futurity. In the Indian case, for instance, this idea of the colonial past is weaponized in such a way to say, well, we're going to get our glory back, and these are the people who are going to lead us into that future. So I'd say that there's that, and also the learning of each other of these regimes, globally of governments in how they seek to suppress people. So in turning off of the internet, if you look at things that have happened in Kashmir since last August particularly, but have happened in the past too, in Iran, in in Hong Kong, and various kinds of internet restrictions in different parts of the world that have since then happened, but also the pellet blinding of protesters, which was used on a large scale against protesting Kashmiri civilians in 2016, but was recently also used in Chile against protesters. Likewise, the biometrics, the detention camps, against the Uyghurs, and now we hear of camps elsewhere too. The biometrics, facial recognition, those kinds of massive projects that ostensibly are for identitarian reasons, security reasons, but have huge potential for surveillance. So all of these are common, strategies that are being learned from one to the other, and they're feeding off each other. And there is a lot of course, profit for certain actors in this too.
Do you think, just as a supplementary, that the fact that we've got the internet age is, before it was not necessary to turn off the internet because we didn't have the internet. So almost the control is manifest by the methods of communication that we now have, that you can switch on and off. I mean, do you think that's...
That immediately reminded me of Marshall McLuhan's "The medium is the message." I mean, what does the internet tell you? It is, I think that there is a lot of potential for lots of things. I'm often repeating this with technology, that there is potential for surveillance, there is potential for repression, but that should not be the reason why people are not allowed access to it. Sure, there are problems with fake news, there are problems with anonymously people spreading hate, but that should be countered by, in fact, I think digital education, which needs to happen really early on. And I feel modern democracies, that's really essential everywhere, for people to understand how to distinguish, how to fact check, how to know that it's the same sort of thing that in an earlier generation you would tell students, like, don't just believe something because it's printed on paper. You have to see what the sources are. And I think we need to do that for political news, especially on the internet.
Yes. Well, Audrey, you can go back in time as well, because you're looking, also as a historian, more into how this is, again, nothing new, and there has been a systematic sort of control element and an sort of one kind of strand characteristic in India in particular. We've seen the recent moves against Muslims, but this is going back in time also.
Absolutely. As you say, as a historian, I tend to take a sort of long view of things, and in my case, that usually means going back to pre-modern times, pre-colonial times. One thing I was thinking about as Nitasha was speaking, specifically about the internet, right, as a means of control. Sure, there are inbuilt things, but you think about the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. At that point in time, there are many European nations that exercised or attempted to exercise pretty significant control over printed materials, right, by policing printing presses and things like this. And you never really saw similar efforts in Mughal India. There were occasionally attempts to censor texts and prevent certain things from being distributed in the Mughal Empire, but nothing on the scale of what we saw in, say, Britain at the same time. In fact, Britishers who showed up to Mughal India were generally amazed by the relative degree of religious freedom, right, and sort of intellectual freedom that they found. So I agree that it goes back, but I don't know that it really goes back before the colonial period, right? I think that that's really when you start to see Hindu-Muslim conflict as such, right, in the as such matters. Hindus and Muslims have been killing each other for as long as the two have been in contact, right? When the Mughal emperors went on campaigns, they killed everyone in their path, whether they were Hindu or not, okay? But there were a lot of Hindus around. But when I say Hindu-Muslim conflict as such, I mean the targeting of Hindus for being Hindu, or the targeting of Muslims for being Muslim. That's really something that we see come up as a sort of large-scale problem during the British colonial period, right? And that has to do with British ways of categorizing people according to religious identities and emphasizing that above all else. And at the end of the day, it seems to me that what once served their British colonial masters very well now serves the interests of India's ruling elites, right? And I find that very unfortunate, if to some degree predictable, right? That the same means of exercising power for one group would also work well for another.
But in a way, it's strange because we've had over 70 years since the end of British colonial rule. Why is it now really manifesting itself big time, 70 years later?
I don't know that I have a really clear answer on that. I think that, the sort of implosion of the Congress Party on various fronts is certainly part of that, right? That's, never underestimate the appeal of the BJP as simply being not Congress, right? I think that that's part of it. We're obviously seeing a rise of sort of ethno-nationalism across the globe, as well as a rise in Islamophobia. And, something about the sort of, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious nature of India that was once the sort of great pride of the nation, right? India was exceptional. And I thought of that when Vali said that India is sort of not exceptional now in certain ways that it's moving, and I agree, but I think that India was exceptional, right, for decades. And that's sort of, I think that's part of why there has been such an outcry, both from within India with ongoing protests and from many of us who are outside of India and criticizing it. And this is a question that I get sometimes, right? Like, why am I always criticizing India? Many times Indians specifically ask why I don't criticize Pakistan as much. And part of the answer is that there is a lot to lose in India that perhaps was lost here a long time ago.
Yes, I mean, Vali, would you agree with that? I mean, particularly putting it in the context that this is a phenomenon that's not just exclusive to India, maybe because we were sort of so used to India as this sort of faceted, accepting everything, hundreds of religions, languages, that we're so surprised that it's gone in the direction that it's gone.
I agree. I mean, for a very long time, India was an outlier, as Audrey said, because, for instance, we assumed that countries have to achieve a certain level of wealth before they democratize. Political scientists often talked about this threshold, and India was always below this threshold. Its economic profile, GDP per capita was more like many sub-Saharan countries than it was like democracies. And so in some ways we thought that, it was already building and entrenching democracy, not because it's in the constitution or how its leaders behave, because we saw Indira Gandhi try her hand at authoritarianism for a couple of years, it didn't work, but largely because the average Indian had, by practicing elections at various levels, had learned about democracy small d. In other words, it now was in the blood of Indians that they are a plural society. It's about give and take of politics. And in fact, when Congress lost its domination over India and you had a multitude of regional parties become important, this sort of give and take became even more intensive. Other countries that had this kind of pluralism, like Italy, have also had a similar kind of backlash, that nothing gets done, there is lethargy, nothing moves ahead, and therefore, you need much more of a consolidated government. But I would just say, I mean, there was also always a feeling that, authoritarianism and a centralized state is the art of the possible. So if you have a smaller, homogeneous country, it's easier to have dictatorship over it. But India was just not, it was not possible to stage military coups in India. It was not possible to have authoritarianism. In fact, many argued that when Indira Gandhi tried and failed was not because she didn't have the will to be a dictator, but that India was particularly unruly. And now what Modi is proving is that if you actually changed India, if you made it more homogeneous at some level, it's more possible to exercise authoritarian power. And the only way you can make India homogeneous is not around sort of a pluralistic idea of democracy or sort of a Nehruvian democracy, is around idea of religion and Hindutva. And I guess there is some, even though they won't admit it, there is some inspiration from the Islamic world, from even Israel, these other countries where religion has played this homogenizing role. And he's basically the success of BJP and RSS in propagandizing Hindutva as a first step, creating a cadre and infrastructure for it, now actually allows him to sort of play this dominant role.
Yes,
but I would just sort of finish by saying that violence of the kind that he's perpetuating against Muslims, and particularly in Kashmir, should not be seen as sign of his success. It's actually a sign of resistance that he's facing. And therefore, he has to go beyond ideology to actually resort to outright violence.
Yes, I mean, that's a very important point, that it shows that not everybody is accepting it. But what I would say is, would we say education has something to do with this, or lack of education? Because a significant number, I mean, we're talking about a population of 1 billion, so a significant number of millions are buying into this. And so is it a question of they need better education? I mean, we can argue about how good the education is, or, reading and writing. Is that that's not really education?
Well, we'll see how successful it is. I'm not sold on the fact that it's the glass is half full or half empty. I mean, tomorrow President Trump is going to arrive in Gujarat. He's going to be taken to the shrine to the ashram where Gandhi lived and practiced, and the message is basically to connect Modi as the direct heir of Gandhi and sort of erase Nehru out of history. Now, will this actually work in India? I'm not sure about it. No. But I sort of witnessed this in Pakistan working on Islamist parties. there is a long period of time, nobody takes them seriously. They're under the radar. Nobody sees them. This was true of Jamaat Islami, which I worked at. But they're there, and they're gradually sort of, you don't see it, it's below the water until it appears above the water, by which time it has tremendous amount of capabilities built in. So I would say probably RSS and BJP have had similar kind of trajectory. The decades that we thought India was completely secular, they were recruiting, they were indoctrinating, they were honing their strategies, their ideologies. And by the time they emerged, like in Pakistan in 1970s, it already was a force that nobody saw it coming.
Yes. Well, let's not forget that the RSS gained its inspiration in the 1930s from the Mussolini's fascism.
That's right.
Natasha, what do you think? One hopes, not for the worst outcome.
Yes, as the discussion was developing, I was just asking myself, really asking myself, be honest, why are you uncomfortable with this talk of Indian exceptionalism? Are you really uncomfortable? And then I just got to the point of, okay, let's interrogate this desire for wanting to claim Indian exceptionalism in the past at this moment. It's because things are so wrong right now, and we want to hold on to the idea that it was really good at some point in the past. Now, from an outside perspective, yes, perhaps, because I am often struck by how common it is for people in the West, term used under erasure with all its problems, so I mean Europe, America, for example, for people to assume India is Hindu. And has always been. And,
Yes,
India is just a Hindu
growing
country.
Up in Britain, I hear Hindu India, Muslim Pakistan.
Yeah, so, and it's not just the Huntington sort of a discourse. It's just always, people's automatic default understanding India is Hindu. So in that sense, yes, it was quite something to hold on to the idea of secularism to some extent in theory and practice both. However, there is also, I think, there's also a need to recognize that there has also been an alternate history of the country, like of other countries, but also in the Indian case, of there always being a lot of things happening against the grain of that stated official narrative. And that's the competing right-wing vision of Indian nation and of nationalism. The RSS was founded in 1925. So we're well nigh on 100 years of real hard work, done by these root and branch cadres, in every profession over a long period of time. So nothing's inevitable. It's not just, I'm somewhat uncomfortable when people say that, this had to happen because of all of these other things. No, there's actually a lot of conscious effort that went into making the RSS, succeed. And now what we have is not just the BJP, we have Modi-led BJP, of which RSS is the ideological parent. So there's a couple of things I want to say. Firstly, I think that the reason they are able to do what they are right now is partly also linked to the global moment. I think that the last 20 years, since we've got the breakdown of the post-Second World War liberal democratic consensus, it's, these years, they're globally, we can't just look at them within any one country because they are part of this particular global moment. Right, and also I don't think, Audrey, I don't think you were implying that Hindus and Muslims were always enemies, right? Yeah, because that ancient, yeah. But people often assume that, and in the case of Kashmir conflict, that's something that plays such an important role, whereas it's so problematic, this kind of ancient hatred type thing. And as Vali and Audrey were both highlighting, this thing of what's happening in India right now is that, yeah, we could have this party win the elections, but elections are not necessarily reflective of substantive democracy at the moment. And
Yes.
because of the way in which finances as well as media have a role in elections in most countries. And there is probability, yes. And I think in spite of everything, we have some reason to hope, given the nature of the resistance that is unfolding in the country. And lots of people who at great cost to themselves are resisting that project of homogenizing and creating this kind of homogeneous political subject. I'm firmly with Arendt in this idea of power and violence being opposites in that sense of power. That you need that resort to violence when you don't have power. When you actually don't have the force of consensus, you need to resort to violence. So the very fact that the regime has to go to such lengths to actually physically brutalize people indicates that they have absolutely no, they certainly don't have the consensus that they would want. So there is a lot of resistance.
So should we be pinning our hopes on civil society and really bolstering civil society in a way from our international perspective to sort of throw out a lifeline that you know, we are happy to help, you know, whether it's through journalism, through writing, through media, through, you know, all manners of media outlets, to show that civil society in India that we're with you. Audrey?
I certainly think that showing solidarity is very important. You know, but I think that civil society has proved to be pretty weak. And that's not just in India. We're seeing that in the United States as well right now, that when faced with figures that have authoritarian ambitions, so civil society appears to be much thinner than we might like. You know, you mentioned journalism. I mean, a number of journalists in India have basically completely capitulated now to the regime, and they just go with whatever the Modi line is, right?
Is that because of economics?
I think it's economics. I think it's fear, and I think some of that is quite legitimate fear. You know, I mean, for me, you know, as an outsider, as a Westerner, as a non-Indian, you know, I am very happy to extend solidarity, and I do so wherever possible, and I'm happy to amplify voices, but the struggle has to come from within. And that is something that is very hopeful right now about the Indian moment, right, is that Indians are out protesting in the streets, right, and it's not just Shaheen Bagh in Delhi. There are dozens of Shaheen Baghs all over the nation of India. And we're seeing that in, you know, I mean, you think about what this is sort of being, you know, kind of spurred by. It's being spurred largely by the CIA, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and this sort of discriminatory treatment of religious minorities. You know, in the United States, we have discriminatory treatment of religious minorities in the form of the Muslim ban, and we're not out in the streets protesting. Here in Pakistan, you have all sorts of laws that are discriminatory against your religious minorities, and you're not out in the streets protesting them either. And in India, they are. And I think that sort of resistance on a very large scale gives me great hope and something with which to have solidarity.
So yes, I mean, I agree with you. I think there is the hope of resistance. There's a wonderful, I don't know if anyone's seen it, but I was in New York before Christmas, and Kashmiri, have you seen this, Nitasha? She drew this poster, you know, of the Ferran with the right, exist to resist. And it's a wonderful sort of symbol of that, you know, civil society can resist. But how powerful do you think it would be in India?
I mean, it's hard to tell you know, what the eventual outcome of it will be. That will also partly depend upon the extent to which people are. Are you okay? That will also partly depend on the extent to which people are able to actually create affective imaginaries out of the solidarity. Because, you know, if you have people struggling on their own individual issues but not willing to speak for other people who are resisting, then I think the movement can't get very far. Because you need the students to realize, you know, the farmers to realize, you know, the situation of the Dalits, to realize the situation of the people who are being affected through unemployment and you know, and of course there's Kashmir. So there's all of these things, and the constitutional, of course, the CAA, the NRC. So all of these different things, people have to realize and be able to mobilize a common understanding. That doesn't have to be a purist understanding. You don't have to agree with everything on all of those issues. But I think it is important to have affective linkages and to not say, well, we're going to talk about this, but we don't care what you're going to. Because that's the only way, you know, struggles against proto-fascist projects succeed, is when you recognize that this is not just about one identity. It goes for the, you know, these totalitarian projects go for the easiest ones and then gradually work their way through to, you know, to the ones closer to the core. So I think this is a moment for many Indians also to realize this, about the situation of Kashmiris as well. So.
Yes, I mean, one thing, just as a follow-up to that, is that there are people among the Kashmiris who are saying, well, because of the Citizens Amendment Act, which affects all Muslims in India, those Muslims in India don't really care about the Muslims in Kashmir. And so it's diluted the international attention on Kashmir because now it's all on the Citizens Amendment Act. Do you think that's what's happening? Exactly what you're saying. They're caring about what bothers them, not what bothers also the other Kashmiri, the other Muslims in Kashmir.
And yes, and that's not going to be a straightforward thing. But I think on the Kashmir issue, there never has been a real equivalence between Indian Muslims and Kashmiri Muslims, because the Kashmiri struggle, you know, and in all of its complicated history, has never straightforwardly been a communal religious struggle. Like back in history, you know, there were moments, we can choose which moments we want to emphasize out of that long history, but there have been moments when this struggle has been a sort of nationalist, pan-Kashmiri struggle. And if we choose to build a history that also focuses on those moments, we would see the problems and we would understand why Indian Muslims do not empathize with the Kashmiris, because nationalism is a very strong ideology. And also in situations where minorities are threatened in India, it probably becomes even harder for them to speak up, even if they do realize, for the causes. So it's also that move,
Yes.
that, you know, as an Indian Muslim, you might also face, you know, you might also be asked greater proof of your nationalist credentials.
Vali, I just wanted to, because I've been told our session's ending in 10 minutes. I thought we were on till 5 o'clock. Oh. Anyway, so I want to open it to questions, but just on the economic aspect, how much does that come into play, you know, in terms of how mobilized people can be, but they'll keep their head under the parapet because of their own vested interests, their own economic interests, and indeed fear?
Well, I mean, there are two ways to think about an economic impact. One is that whether it causes disruptions internally that could impact production, labor, you know, supply chains, and the like. And I guess the calculation that Modi has made is that whether in Kashmir or across India, that the policies are not going to disrupt the economic growth of the country. The second issue is that does it impact you know, foreign investment in India? Does it impact India's image? And I think, you know, we're at a very particular time in history where you know, you have a group of strong men basically who are sort of nourishing off of one another. And so, you know, you have Xi Jinping in China, now you have Modi in India, you have Putin, you have Erdogan in Turkey, and you know, you could even add
Trump.
America's president to it. And they don't, in none of these cases, they're seeing that this kind of behavior is actually having a direct economic impact. For instance, what has been the punishment on China economically for what it's done to the Uyghurs? And even if you looked at it, the silence from the Muslim world for what's happening in China and then also what's happening in Kashmir is deafening. I mean, even Pakistan has not really criticized China on what's happening with the Uyghurs. And also for a long period of time, it was the United States that was the flag bearer on holding countries' feet to fire and supporting civil society in particular, and at least psychologically giving a boost to civil society to resist. And then there was a sense that the United States could exact some kind of a repercussion in the market if the image of a country becomes negative. And the US is just not playing that role. It essentially is highly selective in enforcement of human rights. So human rights in Iran is a big issue for the United States, but the killing of Khashoggi is not even an issue worthy of mention by the United States. So all Modi would think he needs to do is to make sure that Trump really enjoys his trip to India next week, and then there's not going to be no pressure.
Yeah. So what we've really lost is a moral conscience, which
That's
is
right.
rather depressing. I think we do have some time for questions. Our session finishes at 5, so we've got I think more than the 10 minutes. So do we have some roving mics, and have we got some audience? I can't quite see the audience actually. If we've got some questions, yes, this gentleman here. Just hold on. Is there a mic? I think the mic's coming, or have we got all the mics? Just hold on. No, because we won't hear you. Natasha, maybe can we have your mic?
Take this mic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Here. Wait for the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is a little bit very general in nature. Like, I mean, I just want to put into light this thing, you know, the way we are moving into this globalization era, these polarized identities are coming to surface. Question is, like, I mean, is this something natural to globalization, the way the world is splitting into this Modi's world, Trump's world, and this kind of a world? Or we as a states have failed to deal with the globalization, with the nature of globalization? And there is another question, like, that is, Do you think, like, I mean, the kind of digital transformation that we are having right now in the face of globalization, this has completely changed the theoretical underpinnings of a nation? Like and because of this technological world, everybody has a chance to speak up, and states are not accepting this reality. They want to turn themselves into a kind of a homogeneous identity. They do not want to pitch themselves in a kind of a pluralistic way, and its reflections are coming in a kind of a Trump's America, Modi's India. These are the two questions. I hope I have conveyed the questions.
Yes, I hope you made the questions. Natasha, would you like to answer
Yes,
that?
please. I do want to. So you see, the thing is, I'm glad you asked about globalization. I think that there are forces that are both centrifugal and centripetal at work at any point in time, political and social forces. So with globalization, which is to say moving both towards the center and away from the center. So what we are witnessing right now is, on the one hand, this thing which seems like it's just happening coincidentally in different countries, because we're thinking within most people are thinking within the methodological nationalism of nation-state containers. But actually, the important parts of those processes are happening trans-border. So it doesn't matter if farmers are dying, for example, as a result of government policies, right? Because firstly, what you need to do is to have the media not cover it, or not as much, right? So you need to have the spin, so that's what they'll do. Secondly, the fact that companies may not want to invest in those regions or whatever, that can be dealt with through business linkages happening as a result of these trips, through diaspora origin politicians appointed to important positions in cabinets in Western countries, whose interests may, whose functioning may be completely okay with all of the rest of that happening. So there are complicated trans-border processes that are happening in this global era, which cannot be understood within a country container. And also, I think I'm so very sorry because I said this in the morning too, but I need to say this again. What we are witnessing in multiple countries is actually the formula of a global league of electorally legitimated, not democratic, electorally legitimated misogynist authoritarians who claim a monopoly on nationalism. I'm sorry, but it's like my E is equal to MC square. I have to say this. They're a global league of electorally legitimated misogynist authoritarians who claim a monopoly on nationalism, come to power challenging neoliberalism while benefiting from crony capitalism. And it's true in each of these individual countries, and this is why this is not an individual project. It's a project that's actually got a lot in common, and it is our fault in the citizens of different countries if we don't recognize these commonalities, which are just happening to people who are different looking than us. So, and the role of the media, as I said, anything can happen, but if it's covered by spin, people will not know what, the reality of that is. And there is, I think, on the digitality front, I do want to say that it is important that technology allows us these, rhizomatic understanding of affinities, that these things are happening in different contexts to people who are not like us. As I was saying at the start, whether it's pellet blindings or internet, they're learning, these projects are learning from each other in very smart ways. So, I just think that I needed to say that. Oh, also, these are hegemonic projects, a good hegemonic project, and that's the difference, the Gramscian difference between hegemony and dominance, right? In a hegemony, simplistically put, the dominated are also on board with the project, even though the project dominates them. So as a successful hegemonic project, this kind of project, it needs to be able to reconcile contradictions, right? So it needs to say some things in ways that the corporates think and the grassroots both think that it's serving their purpose, and the national and international. So this is why the Gandhian talk for the world media, right? Because that's what the international audience needs to hear, and then within you can have these, what are those people? Sakshi Maharaj and what's the other name of Sadhvi Pragya Thakur? Was her original name, or Ajay Bisht, the UP's chief minister, who has been, so within the country, it's a different thing for domestic constituencies and something else for international consumption. So these are successful projects that are managing to reconcile these contradictions and use the spin in order for the real violence not to be able to be heard. So we have to constantly kind of struggle against that.
Yes, I mean, It's wonderful. I was sitting in on the session with Sherry Rahman, and the comment came out that you have to, a nation state must have the ability to withstand freedom as a public good. In other words, we have to be allowed our freedoms and recognize that that is for the public good. Freedom of speech, movement, expression. Vali, do you have a comment on that, Audrey? Or shall we have, I think we've got another question up there. Yes, we have. Thank you. Have you got the mic? Oh, good.
My first question is, how do you see the future of left in India? While viewing the popularity of left ideology in JNU, Delhi University, and the slogan provided by Kanhaiya Kumar in the protest against CAA, and the overall nature of these protests. So how do you see the future of left in India? And my second question is...
How do you see the future of the left?
Future of left in India.
The left, okay. Yes.
And my second question is, while we see that there is no alternative in India against BJP, and that was the slogan of BJP in the elections of previous elections, that if not Modi, then who? So while we see the protest in Shaheen Bagh in northeastern states, there are sentiments against the central rule. And while we see the Kashmir and Punjab and these West Bengal, these are regions have a sentiment.
Sorry, what's the
against
question here? Why? Your second question?
My question is against our predominant position of the central region, the UP, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra in India in relation with the northeast and northwestern states of India.
Okay, right.
Sorry, didn't get the last part.
It's the predominance of the central region of India over...
In a majoritarian rule led by the Modi. So what is the future of left politics?
Sorry, we're answering these questions first.
Yeah, I am only adding to his question.
He's editing the question.
Okay, we're having three questions. If you could keep hold of it. Okay.
Because the
question.
main protest is largely organized by the left in India, by JNU and other universities. So in this context, where do you foresee this left in the future?
Oh, right. That's quite a lot of... Audrey.
So if I might comment specifically on the sort of targeting of universities, right, in India, and we've seen the targeting of three big universities, right, JNU, the premier university in Delhi, and then Jamia Islamia, also in Delhi, and AMU in Aligarh, and the latter two are predominantly Muslim and historically Muslim universities. In addition to the sort of Muslim angle, right, it's not incidental that both Jamia and AMU are historically Muslim universities, and that's why they have been targeted, right? That sort of all goes together. But in addition, when you consider those two with JNU, there is really a sort of assault on knowledge, right? Hindutva ideologues really hate history because it points up some very unsavory aspects of their ideology and where it came from and how ludicrous it really is. And at the same time, though, they really value higher education, right? They really want and yearn for that stamp of approval of science in particular. That's why you have Modi occasionally saying these crazy things about how there was, like ancient, science in ancient India and genetic engineering and all this like nutso stuff, right? And I mean, there's that sort of push and pull, right? I mean, Hindutva sort of wants this internal coherence, but they cannot have it, right? Because they both hate the producers and gatekeepers of knowledge while wanting their approval at the same time. In my opinion, that's not something that's ever going to be resolved. I think that will continue to plague Hindutva ideology going forward.
Yes, we haven't mentioned fake news. I mean, what they really want is fake education.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that honestly, that project can work to some degree within India, right? I mean, if the government gains enough power and enough control, right, you can start changing textbooks, and we've seen that happen in certain
It happens
states.
in many countries. Yes.
Right. And so
textbooks.
you can make your own citizens ignorant to a great degree,
And yet think they're educated.
Right, but somewhat unfortunately for the BJP, Indian history is not limited to India, right? So they're never going to be able to change the narrative on an international scale.
Natasha, do you have a comment on that?
Just wanted to say that, you see, the thing is, yeah, they want to firstly decimate critical thinking. That's because that's essential to making people be unable to distinguish between truth and fact, or truths and facts. And secondly, the corporatization and neoliberalization, commercialization of education and of universities in particular, which is a model that comes to us from UK, US, whatever, in the West, that model, that more and more is sought to be imported, so that things that are not STEM subjects, liberal arts, humanities, the kinds of things that make people think critically, are seen as irrelevant and unuseful. So that is, I think, increasingly going to be the case. And also the way in which their appeal, I think, also comes from and depoliticize the students. This idea that students have no business, which is also part of that package, right? The students just do their thing, they pay their loans, they get their job, and that's it. Then they start paying their mortgages, and etc. That life cycle. So that is something that I think in the Indian and in many other countries, the university space still allows people to think differently. But I think part of what is at core with the appeal of Hindutva sort of ideologies of a lot of people is also this idea of national pride, vis-a-vis the West and all. And people do actually think that, that this is somehow making up for historical wrongs and historical injuries. And I feel like that is a discourse that needs addressing, because
yes, it's patriotism.
They think that, we've been suppressed, all of this has happened, and these people are going to help us regain our pride. And that's what they tap into when they do these spectacles in Wembley or wherever, they go. So I feel like we need a much sharper, I feel like the right is really clever with how it's working right now, even though that sounds really sad. But I feel that we need to decode this project, and we need sharper political strategies to address all the various dimensions of it as well.
Yeah. Vali.
So just very quickly, I mean, there is a difference between patriotism and nationalism. I mean, patriotism is a love of your country and defending it. Nationalism is actually, anywhere in the world, nationalism is an intolerant idea, because it's about, who's in and who's out, who belongs to the nation and who doesn't. And nationalism is based on myths. I mean, every country has myths, and many countries have actually fabricated myths about nationalism and these
the
things.
myths of the nation state in the 16th century.
That's right, but even in modern times, I mean, there are countries that didn't even have historical existence before World War II and have sort of crafted for themselves national myths. I'm a little bit more sort of cautious about what will stick and what won't. I mean, if you look at how perceptions of the truth about Ayodhya has sunk into the soil, as that was really Ram's birthplace after several decades, that if you persistently educate and tell the population the same set of myths, majority of whom don't actually have access to international contradictions, that these can become ultimately the foundations for a new form of nationalism. So the longer Hindutva stays, the longer it has hegemony, the more it's conceivable that some of these things will stick.
So we must place hopes on education in the true sense and civil society. Do we have a question there? Yes.
Here, I have a question.
Oh, wait a minute. Where are you?
Up there.
Up here.
Good. Right.
Yes.
Thank you. I think we've got your question and then that question, then we will have to close. Yes.
So my question is basically the rise of global capitalism, the biggest threat to the protection of human rights worldwide. Because whenever we look at some human rights abuses in one specific country, and it suits the American foreign policy to throw mud on that country and to demean that country to receive their own gains, to receive their own ends, they usually use that. So have human rights become a sort of a foreign policy double-edged sword that you can use it to cut your opponent and then use it to make your own points and your own agenda? Does the protection of human rights even have any basis on its own? Okay. In the era where you have global capitalism rising and not many people caring about it overall.
Okay, does human rights a double-edged sword? Can we just have that mic down to that gentleman there, and then we'll have that question as well, and then we'll wrap up. Okay? Thank you. So that's, yes, and then we maybe answer the questions and have some concluding remarks. No, we're having this question here, just down here. Where's the mic? Well, we won't hear you. Where is she?
Yeah, why don't we take a question from a woman?
Yeah, let's just take the last one.
Yes, the woman there in the green. Yes.
Yes, let's take
Okay, we haven't had a woman's
There's
voice.
also
We do need
here.
one.
There's also one here, Victoria.
Oh no, quick. And the woman.
I just want there to be one.
I agree. Yes, okay. Yes, have you?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is, how much has the existence and politics of the Islamic State of Pakistan shaped and influenced politics in India and the rise of right-wing politics in India? And what is your comment on how the current regime and state is benefiting in using what's going on in India at the moment to further its anti-India propaganda? And finally, what are the lessons for those who are struggling for secular, democratic Pakistan?
Oh dear, that's three questions in one, and all very important questions. How has this impacted on Pakistan? And human rights, a double-edged sword. So, Vali, I think we're going to have to wrap up. I'm afraid we can't have the other questions.
Say quickly, I would push back against that comment about this is all fabricated by America and capitalism to take advantage of things. Look, people in different parts of the world have agency. And conveniently, when it doesn't suit them, it becomes America's fault. I mean, again, I gave the case of China. Individually in this hall or organizations, parties, how many people have objected to Chinese treatment of Uyghurs openly? This has nothing to do with America, right? These, for a particular country that has been beating its chest about Islam, or have you suspended your relations with United Arab Emirates after he gave Modi an award in the middle of the Kashmir crisis? No. So don't blame it on America, in that sense. But I'll leave the rest to you.
Okay. Was that your question? Okay, missing person. Yes, Natasha. Just if you could answer the two questions, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you. So at a substantive level, I understand the concerns of linking this to capitalism. However, I'm just not sure that I would find the word capitalism to be an adequate placeholder in this case because of the way in which capitalism, in our understanding of it, has been linked to class. And I find that the biggest kind of thing that makes capitalist violence keep on going right now is nation-statist ideology. It creates and reproduces the differential worth of human life in different nations because it determines who can have access to what life opportunities on what latitude and longitude. And it's only by restricting those things in that way that you have creation of permanent underclass. So by talking about capitalism in the abstract, I don't think we address this problem of, which in scholarly literature we see as methodological nationalism when we're studying things within lines, and generally speaking, this problem of the nation-statist prejudice. People are so it's linked to economic processes, but I feel like nation-statism is that problem. And also the problem with using a term like capitalism, I feel, instead of and left, because it harks back to the older echoes, whereas I want to talk about progressive change and I want to talk about specific forms of neoliberalism that combine with nationalism and how they function right now. And I find personally that word capitalism doesn't give me the resources to be able to talk about that because of how it has the capitalism, communism, state versus market type of thing. We don't have state versus market right now. We have the state and market functioning effectively on the same side. So the old analysis don't help us. In fact, the state helps the market rather than regulating it or serving as a bulwark against it. On the human rights issue, I do want to say that we have this really important document, the 1948, the UN Declaration. Human rights is not a Western thing. I'm sorry, it serves no one's purpose by pretending it is. How can human rights be Western when the whole anti-colonial struggle that was carried out by the non-Western peoples of the world was for their rights? How can human rights be Western when you have the history of slavery and colonialism? So it's only by these abstract imaginaries that you forget slavery and colonialism on this side, you forget the anti-colonial struggles on the other side, you forget all the internal oppressions on each side, and then you say this is the West and this is the non-West. It's not the case. And it's also unhelpful because within each country, then it allows people to say, oh, well, they're talking about human rights, they're foreign funded, they're this, they're that, they're something else, they're someone's agents because they're talking about these things. Human rights are our common inheritance in any country, anywhere. And the thing about capitalism, these are not things that can be solved easily, but part of this is to link, and I mean, this is a whole different bit of my life, but imagining economics otherwise, is the link between value and values. How we value something, what worth we decide to give it, is linked to questions that are ultimately and fundamentally normative. This is why we don't value housework. We don't value care work, because we decide that actually we don't care as much for it. We'll just, we'll just find people who'll do it for free. So these are, there is no such thing as an economic question which is not also always already a political question. So these are questions on which we can have disagreements and we should actually think about. On the question of Pakistan and the person there, yes, I mean, when I write about Kashmir, there are a lot of people, and, as I have been doing for a long time, there are a lot of people who celebrate that. When I mention, the detentions or abuses against human rights activists in other countries, they say, oh no, but that's not the same. These people are traitors and these people are foreign agents. And I say, well, actually, there are many commonalities in all of these projects. And as people who think critically, we should be able to, to resist at macro, meso, micro, everyday, long-term levels all the time. That's the only way we build a better world.
Audrey, excellent. Final word.
So, I will be relatively brief. I quite like human rights. I think it's one of my highest values. And I think it should be one of your highest values as well. And I think you should be very, very wary of sort of complicated language and invoking these big ideas that are full of silences to talk yourself out of it. On the secular Pakistan point, so I think that one lesson that you can take from what's going on in India right now is that real change is possible. And the way that things have been for the last several decades is not the way that things have to be going forward. The future is not written, and despite sort of popular beliefs to the contrary, history doesn't trend towards the good or towards the bad, right? It's what we make of it. Real people have agency in the world. So if you want a secular Pakistan, keep up the fight.
Well, thank you very much, Audrey, Nitasha, Vali, and LLF 2020 for making this discussion possible. I hope you all feel you've learned something and, can continue learning, and some optimism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.